August 7, 1942. The skies above the Pacific roared with fire and steel. In that chaos rose a young Japanese pilot, Saburō Sakai. To his comrades he was a symbol of courage. To his enemies he was death in the shape of a Zero fighter. His skill was unmatched, his reputation terrifying. But this is not just the story of victories and kill counts. This is the story of a man who, shot through the face and blinded in one eye, refused to surrender. A man who flew hundreds of miles over open ocean, half-conscious, clinging to life by sheer willpower. By the end of this video you won't just know Saburō Sakai as a warrior, you'll see the war through his eyes and feel what it means to fight, to bleed, and to survive against impossible odds. Saburō Sakai's journey did not begin in glory, it began in hardship. He was born on August 25, 1916, in a small farming village in Saga Prefecture, Japan. His family lived in poverty, working the fields to survive. As the third son in a struggling household, young Saburō quickly learned the weight of responsibility. His childhood was not filled with toys or comfort, but with the endless labor of tending crops, enduring the sweltering heat of summer and the bitter cold of winter. Life was harsh, and the skies above often felt like his only escape. Even as a child he would gaze upward, watching the birds soar freely, dreaming of a life beyond the limits of his village. In school, Sakai was far from exceptional. He failed multiple times and earned the scolding of teachers who believed he would never rise above mediocrity. For a boy surrounded by a culture that valued honor, discipline, and achievement, this failure was more than academic. It was deeply humiliating. Neighbors whispered that he would end up no different from generations of farmers before him, tied forever to the soil. Yet within him burned a restlessness, a hunger to prove himself worthy of something greater. This hunger only deepened when, at the age of 11, tragedy struck. His father died, leaving the family burden heavier than ever. To ease their struggles, Saburō was sent to live with his uncle, who introduced him to stricter discipline and a more structured life. His uncle believed in the values of perseverance and sacrifice, lessons that would stay with Sakai long after childhood. Still, the boy carried an unshakable sense of being overlooked, underestimated, and forgotten. That pain, more than anything, fueled his determination to rise. At 16, Sakai made a decision that would alter the course of his life forever. He enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy. For a boy from poverty, the Navy was more than a career, it was a lifeline. It promised him food, shelter, discipline, and perhaps most importantly, an opportunity to escape the destiny of farming. But the Navy was not a place of comfort. From the moment he stepped through its gates, Saburō entered a world where individuality was stripped away, and only loyalty to the emperor mattered. Training was brutal. Recruits were pushed to their physical and mental limits. Discipline was absolute, punishments swift and merciless. A mistake could mean days of beatings or humiliations designed to break the spirit. Many young men cracked under the strain, some deserting, others collapsing in despair. But Saburō endured. The boy who had once failed in classrooms now began to discover his hidden strengths. He was resilient, quick to learn in practical tasks, and capable of enduring hardships that crushed others. As his training progressed, an unexpected talent emerged. Saburō had a natural gift for flying. At first, the cockpits of training planes felt alien, complicated, and overwhelming. But soon instructors noticed how instinctively he handled the controls, how quickly he adapted to the rhythm of the skies. His reflexes were sharp, his focus steady, and above all, his determination unshakable. While others doubted themselves, Saburō felt alive in the air. It was as though the boy who once stared longingly at the sky had finally found his place within it. He pushed himself relentlessly, determined not to waste the opportunity fate had given him. Day after day he endured long hours of drills, endless technical lessons, and grueling practice flights. Each step forward was a step away from the shame of failure that had haunted his early years. When he finally graduated, he did so near the top of his class, transforming from a poor village boy into one of the rising stars of the Imperial Navy. Yet success carried its own burdens. The discipline of the military weighed heavily on his shoulders. The Navy demanded not only skill but complete devotion, and Saburō often wrestled with the harshness of its rules. Still, he pressed on, for he knew that the world beyond Japan was changing rapidly. The winds of war were sweeping across Asia, and the day would soon come when his training would be tested in the fire of combat. By the late 1930s, Japan's ambitions for empire stretched across the continent. Its soldiers and pilots were being thrown into real battles, testing their courage not in exercises but in blood and fire. For Saburō Sakai, this was the moment he had been preparing for. The chance to prove that he was more than a poor farmer's son, more than a failed student. He was ready to carve his name into history, not from the ground he once tilled, but from the skies he had always dreamed of. When Saburō Sakai first took to the skies in combat, it was not over the Pacific but over the vast lands of China. By the late 1930s, Japan had plunged deep into war with its neighbor, seeking to expand its empire. For young pilots like Sakai, this was baptism by fire, a chance to test their training in real battle. The skies over China were unlike the training grounds of Japan. Smoke rose from burning cities, anti-aircraft fire cracked across the heavens, and enemy planes darted like predators hunting prey. Here, Sakai faced the chaos of real war for the first time, where survival depended on instinct and courage. It was in these battles that Sakai's reputation began to form. He displayed a calmness under fire that impressed even seasoned pilots. Where others hesitated, he acted with precision. In the middle of roaring engines and deadly dogfights, he seemed to find clarity. His Zero fighter became an extension of his body, every movement sharp, every decision decisive. But war was never without cost. Sakai saw comrades fall, their planes spiraling into the earth or erupting in flames. Each loss was a reminder of the thin line between glory and death. Yet rather than discourage him, these moments hardened his resolve. For Sakai, every mission was not just a duty to the emperor, but also a way to honor those who never returned. By the time Japan's aggression escalated toward the Pacific, Sakai had proven himself capable. He was no longer the unremarkable boy from Saga Prefecture. He was becoming an ace, a man whose name carried weight in the squadron rooms of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched its infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, dragging the United States into the war. While Sakai himself did not fly in that attack, the event reshaped his destiny. The Pacific had become the new battlefield, and every pilot would be called upon to defend Japan's rapidly expanding empire. Sakai's first missions in this new theater were over the Philippines, where Japanese forces clashed with American defenders. For many U.S. pilots, Pearl Harbor had been a humiliating blow, but in the skies of the Philippines they sought revenge. Sakai, however, proved that Japanese pilots were not to be underestimated. During one encounter, his squadron engaged American aircraft attempting to protect their bases. The dogfight was ferocious, planes twisting and diving in lethal spirals. With calm precision, Sakai maneuvered behind an enemy fighter, his guns spitting fire. In seconds, the plane burst into flames, tumbling into the sea below. It was one of his earliest victories against the Americans, and it sent a chilling message. The skies belonged to the Zero, and Saburō Sakai was among its deadliest masters. As Japan pushed southward, Sakai was sent to the Dutch East Indies. Here he faced not only American pilots but also Dutch and British aircraft. Each battle was a test of endurance and skill. Allied pilots soon realized they were up against something far beyond what they had expected. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero was faster, more agile, and deadly in the right hands. And in the hands of Saburō Sakai, it became nearly untouchable. With every mission, Sakai's kill count rose. He downed bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes with equal ferocity. To his comrades, he became both a role model and a quiet reassurance. If Sakai was in the air, their chances of surviving were better. Yet what set him apart was not just his skill, but his demeanor. While some pilots boasted of their victories, Sakai remained remarkably humble. He credited his Zero, his squadron, and his training rather than claiming the glory for himself. This humility earned him deep respect, both from peers and superiors. Still, the brutality of war was unavoidable. Sakai witnessed countless deaths, friends and rivals alike vanishing in fire and smoke. These losses etched themselves into his heart, but they did not break him. Instead, they fueled his determination. Each mission became a battle not just for victory but for survival. By early 1942, his reputation was spreading. Among Allied pilots, stories of a relentless Japanese ace began to circulate. To face Sakai in the sky was to face near-certain death. For the Japanese press, he became a symbol of national pride, though Sakai himself avoided the spotlight. He was a warrior, not a celebrity, and his focus remained on his comrades and his duty. But even as his victories mounted, Sakai understood a grim truth. No pilot, no matter how skilled, could escape the risks of war forever. Every mission carried the chance that it could be his last. The Pacific skies were vast, and the enemy was growing stronger with each passing month. For now, though, Saburō Sakai stood at the height of his early career, a farm boy turned fighter ace, soaring through the clouds in defense of his homeland. He had proven himself in China, dominated the skies over the Philippines, and carved a reputation in the Dutch East Indies. Yet the greatest tests of his life still lay ahead. Soon he would be chosen for one of the most critical tasks in the Japanese Navy, to protect Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. And in that role, Sakai's name would be forever etched into history, not just for his victories, but for the impossible trial that awaited him. By early 1942, Saburō Sakai was no longer just another skilled pilot. He was becoming one of the most respected and feared aces of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each sortie brought new challenges, and each victory carried his name further into legend. But with fame came greater responsibility. Soon, Sakai would be entrusted with one of the most critical tasks of the war, protecting the life of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack and the strategic brain of Japan's naval campaigns. In the Pacific skies, survival was measured not in days but in missions. Every time Sakai's Zero lifted from the runway, it carried not just bombs or bullets but the heavy weight of uncertainty. Yet time after time he returned, his logbook filling with victories. An ace was defined as a pilot who had shot down 5 enemy aircraft. Sakai reached that milestone quickly, but he did not stop there. In skirmishes over the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, he demonstrated a deadly mixture of precision, patience, and instinct. Unlike many hot-headed pilots, Sakai did not waste ammunition on blind shots. He waited, closing the distance, studying his target like a hunter before striking. When he fired, it was almost always fatal. Soon he would be chosen for one of the most critical tasks in the Japanese Navy, to protect Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. And in that role, Sakai's name would be forever etched into history, not just for his victories, but for the impossible trial that awaited him. By early 1942, Saburō Sakai was no longer just another skilled pilot. He was becoming one of the most respected and feared aces of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Each sortie brought new challenges, and each victory carried his name further into legend. But with fame came greater responsibility. Soon, Sakai would be entrusted with one of the most critical tasks of the war, protecting the life of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack and the strategic brain of Japan's naval campaigns. In the Pacific skies, survival was measured not in days but in missions. Every time Sakai's Zero lifted from the runway, it carried not just bombs or bullets but the heavy weight of uncertainty. Yet time after time he returned, his logbook filling with victories. An ace was defined as a pilot who had shot down 5 enemy aircraft. Sakai reached that milestone quickly, but he did not stop there. In skirmishes over the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, he demonstrated a deadly mixture of precision, patience, and instinct. Unlike many hot-headed pilots, Sakai did not waste ammunition on blind shots. He waited, closing the distance, studying his target like a hunter before striking. When he fired, it was almost always fatal. Soon his tally climbed into the double digits. He downed American Wildcats, Dutch bombers, and British Hurricanes, proving his mastery against a variety of opponents. By mid-1942, his reputation was sealed. Saburō Sakai was one of Japan's deadliest warriors in the air. But Sakai himself did not dwell on numbers. For him, each kill was a grim necessity, not a trophy. Every time an enemy plane went down, he thought not of glory, but of the men inside, fellow pilots who, like him, were simply doing their duty. This quiet awareness of the human cost would follow him throughout the war, shaping him in ways that statistics never could. It was during this period of rising fame that Sakai received news that would change his career. He had been selected to join the elite group of pilots tasked with protecting Admiral Yamamoto. This was no ordinary duty. Yamamoto was not just another commander. He was the architect of Japan's naval strategy, the man who had dared to challenge the mighty United States with the strike on Pearl Harbor. To Japan, Yamamoto was irreplaceable. To the enemy, he was a high-value target whose death could cripple Japanese morale. His safety was paramount, and only the very best pilots were entrusted with the task of guarding him. Sakai understood the weight of this mission. Protecting Yamamoto meant far more than personal honor. It was a responsibility tied directly to the fate of the empire. Failure was not an option. Flying escort missions was a different kind of battle. Unlike free-roaming dogfights, escort duty demanded patience, discipline, and absolute vigilance. Sakai and his comrades would take off in tight formation, scanning the skies with hawk-like eyes. Every cloud, every shadow carried the possibility of danger. The Zero's engine hummed steadily as Sakai's gaze swept the horizon. He knew that at any moment, American fighters could emerge, guns blazing, determined to punch through and reach Yamamoto. The tension was constant, like walking a tightrope where a single mistake could bring disaster. On several occasions, enemy aircraft did appear, diving to break the protective ring around the admiral. In those moments, Sakai's instincts took over. He throttled forward, guiding his Zero into attack position with lethal precision. Bullets streaked past his canopy, tracer rounds lighting the sky, but Sakai did not flinch. His role was clear: intercept, engage, and destroy. In one memorable clash, American bombers attempted to breach the escort line. Sakai dove headlong into the formation, weaving through streams of fire. His guns roared, and within seconds a bomber was trailing smoke, spiraling downward. His aggressive defense, combined with the efforts of his comrades, forced the attackers to retreat. Yamamoto was safe. Every successful mission reinforced the admiral's trust in his protectors. For Sakai, it was a point of deep pride, not personal glory, but the knowledge that he had fulfilled his duty to the fullest. Yet, despite these successes, the reality of escort duty wore heavily on Sakai. He often thought about the paradox of war. Here he was, risking his life to protect a man who strategized the deaths of thousands, while at the same time showing compassion for fallen enemies in the sky. The burden of this contradiction left a mark on him. Still, he never wavered in his loyalty. For Sakai, the duty was sacred. To protect Yamamoto was to protect Japan, and to protect Japan was to protect everything he had ever fought for, from his impoverished childhood to the brotherhood he had built in the Navy. But war is unforgiving, and no pilot, no matter how skilled, could avoid its cruel hand forever. For Saburō Sakai, the test of his life was just over the horizon. Soon, on a mission above the island of Guadalcanal, his fate would change forever. By mid-1942, the Pacific War was entering a brutal new phase. The United States, shaken by Pearl Harbor, was regaining strength. American industry was flooding the battlefield with new planes, new ships, and new determination. The tide of war was shifting, and Japan's aces would be pushed harder than ever before. Sakai knew it. Every pilot knew it. Each mission carried greater risks, each opponent fought with greater ferocity. The days of overwhelming Japanese dominance in the skies were fading. And then came August 7, 1942, the day the U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal. It was here, in the skies above this small island, that Saburō Sakai's courage would be tested in a way no training, no escort mission, and no previous battle had ever prepared him for. The farm boy turned ace, the protector of Yamamoto, the man feared and respected in equal measure, was about to face his greatest trial. Not against an enemy squadron, but against fate itself. By mid-1942, the Pacific was no longer a one-sided war. The Americans had struck back at Coral Sea and Midway, and now, the bloody struggle for Guadalcanal was underway. It was here that Saburō Sakai's fate would take a turn unlike anything he, or any fighter pilot, could have imagined. On August 7, 1942, Sakai and his squadron were dispatched to intercept a massive wave of American aircraft threatening the Japanese fleet. The morning sky was alive with the buzz of engines, tracer rounds cutting through clouds like fiery needles. Sakai was in his element, weaving his Zero through enemy formations, downing one plane after another with a deadly calm. But fate has its own designs. In the middle of the chaos, Sakai spotted what he believed to be a vulnerable formation of dauntless dive bombers. With characteristic aggression, he dove in, certain of an easy kill. Yet in that single moment of overconfidence, his life changed forever. The bombers were no ordinary prey. They were SBD Dauntless, heavily armed with rear gunners who had been waiting for this very chance. As Sakai roared in for the attack, a hail of .30 caliber bullets erupted from their tails. In an instant, agony exploded across his head. A round tore through his skull, blinding his right eye and nearly shattering his jaw. Blood flooded his cockpit, hot and suffocating. The world spun into darkness. For a moment he thought he was dead. But his Zero did not fall. The plane leveled, almost as if refusing to let its master go. Somewhere in the haze between life and death, Sakai's hands clung to the controls. He fought to stay conscious, to breathe, to think. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath him, and home lay more than 4 hours away, a distance no wounded pilot had ever survived. What followed has become one of the greatest survival flights in history. Half blind, his head pounding with unbearable pain, Sakai forced himself to navigate by instinct and memory. Every minute felt like an eternity. His vision faded in and out. The blood in his cockpit dried and cracked under the sun. At times he drifted into unconsciousness, only to jolt awake as his plane dipped dangerously close to the sea. Inside his mind voices battled, one telling him to let go, to surrender to death, another urging him to endure just a little longer. He thought of his family, of the comrades who had already fallen, of the duty that still chained him to the skies. And somehow, with sheer willpower, he pressed on. Hours later, against every law of nature, Sakai spotted the familiar outlines of Rabaul. His Zero, battered and nearly out of fuel, touched down with a bone-jarring crash landing. Ground crews rushed forward, horrified at the sight. A pilot drenched in blood, face shattered yet still alive. Doctors doubted he would survive the night. But Saburō Sakai refused to die. His body clung to life, just as stubbornly as his spirit had clung to that plane over the Pacific. That day, he did not return as the fearless ace who ruled the skies. He returned as something more enduring, a man who had stared into death's abyss and clawed his way back. The moment Saburō Sakai was pulled from his Zero at Rabaul, his comrades believed he had taken his last breath. His face was torn apart, one eye blinded, his jaw fractured, and blood loss so severe that doctors expected him to slip away before sunrise. But Sakai was not a man who surrendered easily, not in the air and not on the ground. For weeks he lay in a hospital bed, drifting between life and death. Every swallow burned like fire through his broken jaw. He could no longer see clearly, and the pain was relentless. Yet he endured. His nurses recalled how he forced himself to remain conscious, gripping the sheets with trembling hands, whispering that he would fly again. And incredibly, after months of grueling recovery, he did. By late 1943, Sakai returned to the skies. Though blind in one eye and plagued by constant headaches, he climbed back into the cockpit of a Zero. To many this seemed impossible. Pilots required perfect vision, perfect reflexes. But Sakai was driven by something more than physical ability. He was driven by pride, duty, and the unshakable spirit that had already carried him through the impossible. Even so, the world around him had changed. Japan's once mighty air force was crumbling. Resources were scarce, veteran pilots were dying, and American air power was growing stronger by the day. Sakai watched as fresh-faced recruits were sent into battle with only a handful of flight hours, many never returning from their first mission. He flew missions through 1944 and into 1945, often against overwhelming odds. Yet, unlike many of his comrades, he refused the call of kamikaze suicide attacks. He believed that a warrior's duty was to fight with skill and honor, not to throw life away recklessly. In his later memoirs, Sakai admitted that he never once considered sacrificing himself needlessly. His survival instinct was too strong, and his belief in living to tell the truth about war too deep. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, Sakai was one of the few elite aces left alive. He had survived hundreds of combat missions, catastrophic injuries, and the collapse of the empire he once served with unquestioned loyalty. For many veterans, defeat brought shame and silence. For Sakai, it brought clarity. In the years after the war, he chose a different path. Rather than basking in his fame as an ace, he sought peace and humility. He worked as a businessman, raised a family, and slowly allowed himself to speak about what he had seen. He traveled abroad, even meeting with some of the American pilots he had once fought against. To their astonishment, they found him warm, honest, and deeply reflective about the true cost of war. Sakai would later tell interviewers that he no longer viewed his kill count as a mark of glory. "Every plane I shot down," he admitted, "was filled with men who had families, dreams, and lives of their own. War is not about honor or glory, it is about loss." This shift, from warrior to messenger of peace, defined the second half of his life. Unlike many of his contemporaries who faded into obscurity, Sakai embraced his role as a living witness. He wrote his memoirs, shared his experiences with younger generations, and used his story to remind others that even in the darkest battles, humanity must not be forgotten. By the time of his death in 2000, at the age of 84, Saburō Sakai had become more than a symbol of Japan's wartime past. He had become a bridge, between enemies turned allies, between the glory of combat and the sorrow it brings, between history and the lessons it must teach us. Saburō Sakai's life was a story of contradictions, victory and loss, honor and regret, pride and humility. To some he was Japan's most celebrated ace, the warrior who defied death in the skies. To others he was a reminder that behind every legend lies a human being, flawed, scarred, and struggling to make sense of it all. His survival flight after being shot in the head remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in aviation history. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not found in combat. It was found in the years after the war when he chose not to glorify killing, but to speak instead of peace. Sakai often reflected that true courage was not only in facing the enemy, but in living with the memories of what war takes away. He carried those memories with him until his final days. And yet, despite the blood, the loss, and the pain, he never surrendered to despair. He lived. He endured. He told his story, so that others might understand. Today, historians remember him as one of the last samurai of the skies, a warrior who walked through fire and returned to warn the world of its cost. His Zero fighter may have been long silenced, but his message still echoes. Glory fades, empires fall, but the human spirit, the will to survive, to endure, to find meaning, remains. And that is why Saburō Sakai's story matters. Not just as a tale of a Japanese ace, but as a lesson for all of us, that even in the fiercest storms, even when the sky itself seems to fall, the strength to rise again lies within us.